A woman in a fur-trimmed coat stopped 3 feet from my post, looked me up and down, and said to her husband, loud enough for the whole forecourt to hear, "Is this man even with the palace? He looks like he's been sleeping in that uniform." I did not move. I never move. 22 years of standing at the eastern gate of Aldenmere teaches a man that the eyes in front of him are not the eyes that matter. The eyes that matter are the ones inside your own head, the ones asking whether you held the line. It was a Thursday morning, overcast, the kind of gray that makes the red of a tunic look almost brown if the wool has gone tired enough. The forecourt was quiet. A handful of tourists drifting toward the grand gate at the far end, where the cameras and the crowds always gathered, and where the guards rotated through fresh kit every season. My gate saw maybe one visitor in 10. That was how I had arranged it, and that was how it had stayed. The woman had stopped because she'd taken a photograph of the wall behind me, the old stone, the ivy, and I had apparently ruined it by standing in frame. She'd looked at the photo, then at me, then back at the photo, and her face had done the thing faces do when something doesn't match the picture in their head of how a palace guard is supposed to look. But she was not wrong, not entirely. My tunic had gone thin at the elbows. The red wool was faded to a tired rust. The brass buttons dulled by years of rain I never stepped out of. My bearskin had lost its shine. I had asked 11 years ago to be left where I was. No transfers, no ceremonial rotations to the grand front gate where the cameras gathered. No new kit issued ahead of schedule. Just this post, this gate, this quiet corner of the wall where the tourist buses rarely turned. The man beside her, her husband, I gathered from the way he had kept checking his phone, instead of looking at either of us. Finally glanced over. Probably some vagrant they let loiter for atmosphere, he said and laughed. Authentic touch. Very European. A small crowd had gathered the way crowds do, drawn by nothing more than the smell of someone about to be embarrassed. Phones came up. I kept my eyes forward, on the middle distance, on the cobblestones beyond the gate where the light was falling gold across the wet stone. "Excuse me," the woman said, stepping closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume over the damp air. "Sir, are you actually a guard, or are you just standing here?" A young security officer had drifted toward us from the direction of the grand gate, drawn by the gathering phones. I recognized him. Hale, 2 years on the job. Eager, the kind who still believed every situation could be talked down before it needed to be. He reached the edge of the small crowd and hesitated, clearly uncertain whether the man at this gate was a colleague who'd lost his kit allowance or a problem he was supposed to solve. "Ma'am," Hale started, "if there's an issue, I can." "There's an issue," the husband said, turning on him with the relief of a man who'd found someone who would actually answer. "Your man here looks like he wandered in off the street. Tunic's falling apart, boots haven't seen polish in a decade. Either he's an embarrassment to whoever runs this place, or he genuinely isn't one of yours, and either way, someone should be telling him to move along." Hale's eyes flicked to me, then to my collar insignia, then back to me, and something in his face shifted. The particular look of a younger man realizing he's standing next to someone whose file he has never been shown and probably never will be. He didn't say anything. He just stepped back, very slightly, and let his hand drop from his radio. 22 years. I had been spat on. I had been slapped once by a man who did not like waiting for a photograph. I had stood through hailstorms and through a summer so hot that 2 tourists fainted at my feet, while I did not so much as blink. None of it had ever moved me, because none of it had ever needed to. This did not need to either. I did not answer her. That was the job. "He's probably deaf," the husband said, "or simple. Don't bother, Celeste." That was when I heard the gate behind me creak. The old service gate, the one that had not been used for an arrival in longer than most of the staff had worked here. I did not turn. I was not permitted to turn. But I heard boots, many boots in step on stone. The crowd heard it too, and the murmuring died. 11 years ago, when I asked to be left at this gate, I had not explained why, and no one above me had pressed. The official reason on file was personal preference. Long service, no further action required. The truth was that I did not want to be looked at, not because I was ashamed, because the men I had served with were not here to be looked at anymore. And it had felt, for a long time, like an insult to stand somewhere bright and decorated while their names sat carved into a wall that almost no one ever visited. So I had asked for the quiet gate, and for 11 years I had gotten it. The kit requisitions came through every season for the Grand Gate Guards, and every season I declined mine. And every season the quartermaster sighed and signed the form without argument, because by then everyone had simply stopped asking why. New recruits sometimes assumed I was a groundskeeper who'd been issued an old uniform as a joke. I let them think it. It was easier than the alternative, and the alternative had never once come looking for me. Until that Thursday, the boots stopped. I heard a voice I had not heard in 11 years say my surname, and then my rank, and then a word that is not used lightly in this regiment, a word that means a man earns something that cannot be given twice. Sergeant Voss. I turned. Protocol allowed it. An order from a superior officer overrides a static post. Standing in the service gate, in full dress, was Colonel Aldrich Ferris, a man I had not seen since the day he pinned a small piece of ribbon to my chest in a hospital corridor and told me, quietly, that 3 of my men had not made it, and that the 4th, the one I had carried 2 miles on a broken leg of my own, was going to live because of what I'd done. Behind him stood 11 other men in dress uniform. I recognized 2 of them immediately, soldiers I had trained years ago before either of us wore ceremonial red. They were not smiling. They were standing the way men stand when they are about to do something they have waited a long time to do.
"At ease, Sergeant,"
the colonel said, though I had not moved from attention. "We've come to collect a debt." The woman in the fur coat had gone very still. Her husband had lowered his phone. 22 years ago, the colonel said, and his voice carried, deliberately, across the forecourt. This man pulled 4 soldiers out of a position that should have killed all 5 of us. He carried one of them on a leg that had been broken twice, broken once by the fall, and again somewhere in those 2 miles, by his own weight on it, though he never told anyone that until I read it in the surgeon's report years later. When he came home, he was offered a commission, a desk, and a medal ceremony with cameras. He paused. He turned down all 3. He asked instead for a post at a quiet gate, where he could stand watch in silence for as long as the regiment would have him. He has stood that watch for 11 years. Most of the men he serves are not aware of who he is. He prefers it that way. The crowd was utterly silent now. Even the pigeons on the railing seemed to have stopped. Hale, the young security officer, had taken his cap off without seeming to notice he'd done it. "What he does not know," the colonel went on, "is that the 4th man, the one he carried, has spent 11 years trying to find a way to thank him without breaking the only request he ever made of this regiment." He turned and gestured, and one of the soldiers stepped forward. I knew him. Of course I knew him. Younger now by 22 years in the only way that mattered, he walked without a limp. The leg I had carried him on had healed straight and clean, and he had gone on to make captain, and I had never once asked anyone what had become of him, because I had told myself it was better not to know, in case the answer was bad. The answer was not bad. "Sergeant," Captain Eamon Vale said, and his voice cracked once before he steadied it. "I asked the colonel for one thing. I asked that whenever this day came it come here, at your gate, where you chose to stand." A full, formal salute, the kind given to a senior officer, though I had never worn that rank, and we both knew it, and neither of us cared. And then, one by one, down the line, every man behind him saluted too. I had stood at this gate through everything a man can stand through without breaking. I had told myself, for 11 years, that nothing left could move me, because the things that could move me were already gone, already buried, already names on a wall I visited once a year and never spoke of. I returned the salute. My hand did not shake. But something in my chest, something that had been held at attention for 11 years, right alongside the rest of me, finally, quietly, stood down. The woman in the fur coat was crying. I had not expected that, and I do not think she had either. Her husband had taken his hat off, which struck me, even in that moment, as the most honest thing I had seen him do. "Sergeant Voss," the colonel said, when the salutes had ended, "the regiment would like to formally invite you to stand the eastern post of the grand forecourt, in new dress, with full honors, beginning this week. The choice remains yours." "But I think," he said, and for the first time in 11 years I saw something close to a smile on that man's face, "that the regiment has waited long enough to be proud of you in public." I looked past him, through the old service gate, to the wall beyond the inner courtyard, the wall with the names. I thought about the 3 men who were on it. I thought about how they had never gotten a forecourt, or a salute, or 11 years of quiet to think it over. "With respect, Colonel," I said, the first words I had spoken aloud at that post in longer than I could remember. "I'd like to keep this gate, but I wouldn't object to new dress." A few people in the crowd laughed, The kind of laugh that comes out when people don't know whether they're allowed to, and then decide they are. The colonel nodded. Once, the way men of his generation nod when they've gotten the answer they expected and are glad of it anyway. Done, he said. The woman in the fur coat approached me afterward, when the regiment had formed up and marched back through the service gate the way they'd come, their boots fading into the ordinary sounds of the forecourt. She did not apologize in words. She simply reached into her coat, took out a small velvet box, a watch I learned later that had belonged to her own father, a man who had served and never spoken of it either, and pressed it into my hand. I don't know what to say, she said. You don't have to say anything, I told her. Standing here is the job. The rest just happens around it. She left. The crowd thinned. The light kept falling gold across the cobblestones, the way it had been falling the whole time, and I turned back to face the gate, and stood. A week later, they issued me new dress. The same red, the same black bearskin, polished the way it should have been polished for years. I wore it to the same post. The tourists who come through now sometimes ask why an old guard with a slight gray at his temples stands at a quiet gate, instead of the grand one out front, where the crowds and the cameras gather, and the photographs always turn out well. I don't answer them either. Some things are not for the crowd. A man who has carried what needed carrying does not owe the rest of his life as an explanation to strangers, and I have found after 22 years that the not explaining is its own kind of peace. But if you look closely, just inside my collar, where no camera ever points, there is a small strip of worn red wool, cut from the old tunic, the one she called a beggar's coat, sewn in by my own hand the night before the new one arrived. Some debts you don't pay off. You just carry them where they belong and keep standing.